So hello boys and girls, we're talking about Sloterdijk's Infinite Mobilization, which is a recent translation of the work of Peter Sloterdijk, who I regard as one of the greatest thinkers of our time. And the core idea of the text is to describe postmodernity as a result of modernity's imperative to move everything. And we can understand that very well by describing the term of action. An action is a self-induced deed that I do, initiated by my own will, and it is quite mysterious. But this is how modernity understands itself, like an autonomous way of acting. And Sloterdijk thinks that as a side effect of this active voice, we get into the severe problems that we encounter in our times nowadays. And he calls this the thinking avalanche. So let's just jump into the question of the thinking avalanche. So he says this is a self-reflexive natural catastrophe in contrast to Pascal's idea that men are thinking read. He says, no. We are way more. We are thinking avalanches that cause landslides that bury themselves. So this is the major idea, and he thinks that the Marxist as well as the Frankfurt school, they are not really capable of grasping this phenomenon. So he writes, they have up to now remained irrelevant because they either do not grasp their object, the kinetic reality of modernity as mobilization. So he calls that again a kinetic reality, right? Something is moving. And modernity has to be described by the metaphor of mobilization. That's his major idea. And they are unable to point out a critical difference to it because they are mobilizers themselves based on the effect they have. So, and this is a general critique of the modern ideas of, for example, revolution, that they say we have to change something, and they don't see themselves as part of the problem, as mobilizers. Doesn't mean that any revolution or desire to change is entirely false, but it has to have a self-reflective ability that Sloterdijk demands here. And then there is a second reason for why they remained irrelevant, and that is that the diagnosis of present times must be brought into a kinetic and kinesthetic dimension, because if they are not, all talk of modernity passes what is most real. So that's basically the same argument. We have to make it self-reflective. And he says that this means to formulate the modern active voice into the passive voice. So again, what does he criticize? That modernity has overfed us with theories of action. What it knew of suffering is only that it could be used as an engine for actions. So it was criticizing suffering, but it was not including suffering in its own ideas. It was just the fantasy of abolishing whatever is suffering caused by an outside, illegitimate force. And now what he believes should arise from that in postmodernity is a second passivity. So we have the first passivity of what he calls the old world. Then we have the modernity that says, no, human being is active. This passivity was wrong. But now we have to understand that even action induces a second passivity that underlies it. So why is there a second passivity underlying it? He calls it is a quasi-karmic debit interrupts the deeds and doers in history to undermine their very projects and intentions. We will investigate this karmic irony in kinetic terms. So why does he use the term of karma? Well, it is because any action has side effects. No matter as well as intended it will lead to consequences that are undesirable. And he expresses this. Whoever moves always moves more than just themselves. Whoever makes history always makes more than just history. This more is the typo that distorts the neatly drawn-up text. It is the kinetic surplus which shoots beyond borders and past targets into a region not aimed for. The fatal more joins the momentum of the dead masses who have forgotten all about moral purposes once in motion. So there's always a more that is not about the moral intentions, but an effect of originally moral intentions. This kinetic capital blows up old worlds. It has nothing against them. It simply cannot be stopped on principle. It makes the flow of goods flow, fleets cruise, escalators glides, climates change, and faunas disappear. The naive times in which humans could think that their movement was necessary for the world to move forward are over. Meanwhile, the movement goes on, the pure movement. While the gracious defenders of modern accomplishment bow down to theories of human actions and talk about the norms of the latest reason for acting. An ugly suspicion makes its rounds in the rest of the world. Could kinetics and fate be one and the same? So what he says here is that all of our small moral intentions, all of our small acting, in its conglomeration, is what drives this world. And it is interesting because there is not a single master plan where somebody says, I want to send huge container ships, gigantic in proportion, from China to America. Of course, there's a company that plans it, but there is not a big mastermind behind that. It is rather the kinetic energy that is released from our small actions that just add up as a whole and that constitute something that we then recognize as capitalism. A capitalism without actor, a market without a planning mind behind it. All of it are just the small plans of sometimes moral individuals or sometimes just acting individuals. However, the problem that Sloterdijk sees here is the actor who predicates himself a ingenuity and a right for action that in its sum will be worse than the intended good results. So this is what Sloterdijk then calls the mobilization of the planet, and now he explains it from the spirit of self-intensification. What is that self-intensification? The self-intensification is us understanding ourselves in terms of moral agents who have the power to move, who understand ourselves as first movers. So how do we have to look at that? So there are three axioms that he formulates. First, we move in a world that is itself in motion. Second, that the self-movement of the world both includes and surpasses our self-movement. Third, that in modernity, the self-movements of the world emerge out of our self-movements, which are cumulatively added to world movement. So we have a new moving actor, right? It's not self-moving nature anymore. It's not God who gives it a push. It's the understanding that we give pushes. But of course, the way we give the pushes, the way we move the world is a bit more complex. So in the following, Sloterdijk analyzes the ethics of modernity, which he says is kinetics. And if we look at all the people who want to change the world to the better, who want to, for example, abolish capitalism, which is not intrinsically wrong, that's not what he's saying, but which may be a bit naive with regard to the idea that we can once and for all change the world. So if we look at these consciousnesses that stem from modernity, we will see that there is a I don't know how you say that in English. In German, we say liaison between kinetics and morality. And he wants to express that by analyzing the idea of progress, right? Because morally we have to make progress. And he says, if we are talking about progress, what we really mean is the kinetic and kinesthetic ground motive of a modernity that only aims to remove the limits of human self-movement. So progress is, for Sloterdijk, an idea that is not necessarily fixated on a concrete object, but it is fixated on the idea of improvement itself. It's pretty much like we see it also in Ray Kurzweil, where he tries to think the idea of progress in its extreme. So initially we assumed that progress is a moral initiative which would not rest until it actualized its goals of improvement. The experience of true progress entails that a worthwhile human initiative stems from within itself, bursts the bounds of its previous mobility, widens its circle of influence, and brings itself to the fore in good conscience vis-a-vis both its inner inhibitions and outside resistance. That is the doctrine of progress that is formulated in a very positive way. Nevertheless, there is a hidden connection. So he writes, the essence of subjectivity is inseparable from the mysterious force that expresses itself as the ability to initiate new chains of movement, which we label as action. So there's somehow a mysterious force in us. It's somehow hidden what it really is, but we call it action, so that in a sense we can cause new things. Whenever the thought of progress goes through the mind of a subject, the self-igniting mechanism within that thought already initiates progress-like self-movements. So action is the idea that if it is a moral action, we can something turn to a better from within ourselves. So, and there is a certain emptiness to that movement that he finds, right? So, like, in a sense, progress is based on a self-creation where we take a step forward, but the only idea is that after taking a step forward, we take another step forward. And a step is essentially only progressive if it leads to an increase in the ability to take steps. Progress is therefore the movement towards movement towards greater movement, and movement towards an increased ability to move. So what he says is, of course, that all the modern ideas of moral action, they cannot really develop an utopia. We have seen like these utopian models fail again and again. So they actually abstain from that now, but they say, well, let's do it step by step and increase our possibility to make more and more progressive steps. But by that, the ethical imperative is just to follow the kinetic impulses of modernity, which is a perpetuum mobile. So he actually analyzes later and says that Miller was the first to realize that in that sense we are an a priori step-producing individual who does not need any further impulses. At least that's how we imagine ourselves. And he thinks that this idea of pure mobilization is the original problem of our time. So I think these thoughts are very interesting. I think Sloterdijk is in that sense a great thinker who sees that we go in the direction of a complete mobilization. He describes our time in a very good metaphor. And we see that this mobilization also comes to the fore in what Elon Musk dreams of, a time where objects move themselves for our ethical desires. We are just the reasons, the initiators, but then the world moves around us. The idea is that the world is not a natural movement anymore that evolves around the sun, but the idea is that all that the world is is in its kinetic energy to serve what we are ourselves. Now, the question is then, however, how do we understand ourselves? And of course, Sloterdijk will say that we understand ourselves in terms of this kinetic energy. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you got something out of that. It's not that there is a great agenda that I have here. It's rather just a passive perception of what Sloterdijk is writing in this book. And if you enjoy that, if you feel like you can take something out of that, then just subscribe to the channel, give me a like, and you know what to do. Other than that, live long, find more rest. Find more rest in an ever-moving world. And then you may prosper not only materially, but maybe also spiritually.